Hello, and welcome to the Regrettable Century. I'm Chris.
I'm Kevin.
I'm Jason.
I'm Jess.
And say what's up, Adam. Adam's back.
Hello, everybody. I am happy to be joining y'all for this topic in particular.
Adam had a procedure done to make his voice sexier, and it was a success. Adam is 3 times more sexy than previous.
Yeah, it's called a Tom Waits-otomy.
I was going to say, it's really a little bit too much sexiness. It's a sexiness overload now.
Oh, I'll turn it down on my audacity. I'll turn down the sexiness.
Yeah, take it out in post, please.
Yeah.
And today we are talking about mental illness as a social problem. And so we've got Adam, actually, tell us about what it is that you do.
Well, I am a licensed clinical social worker. I specialize in the treatment of complex trauma and trauma-related mental illness. I am a complex trauma survivor myself. I also am a frothing at the mouth communist and think that you cannot understand what quote-unquote mental illness is without having a pretty hardcore dialectical materialist view on it. And I think that most of what the discussions around mental health and mental illness on the left typically exhibit to me are sort of these unexamined assumptions based in what is called the medical model and a very sort of liberal, even downright reactionary view of what mental health and mental illness are. So I thought it might be an interesting thing for us to talk about how, for me, mental illness, I think, is the perfect sort of intersection between subjective and objective conditions. I think it's where it plays out most violently. So what better place to talk about it than with my revolutionary pessimist comrades here.
And I'm qualified to talk about this just because I have mental illness.
Which is a valid qualification. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, based on the readings we did. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. I
Well-
didn't even realize I had this many traumas.
Actually, I'm kind of glad we're starting with that because it might be a really important thing for us to even try to define or sort of bring into the conversation, like, what does it mean to talk about trauma? Like, what's the difference between interpersonal traumas and how those connect up to social and institutional traumas? Because I think most of the approach that I take in terms of my own mental health, but also helping others with the healing process from mental health and trauma is that it is impossible to separate individual subjective conditions from the objective ones. And I think I'm a bit of a trauma reductionist, let's say. And I think a very, very large portion of what leads to mental illness as it gets diagnosed is actually a very protective, I would dare even say, attempt at a healthy response to very, very violent, traumatic, systemic conditions.
Yeah.
Why? Why do you think it's a healthy response? I'm just curious.
Well, so in my approach to therapy and especially around trauma, a lot of the time, whenever we talk about what trauma is, we have this, I think, like a very medicalized kind of model of it. We think that trauma is only something that, typically happens to people who have experienced what we call acute trauma, which is you've been in combat, you've experienced sexual assault, maybe you've experienced a violent assault, something like that. And I think that a lot of the time, because of the medical model, which basically, just to define that, it's this idea that what essentially mental illness is it's a disease of the mind. And you need to treat it the way you would treat a disease of the body. And in the approach that I use, which is kind of drawing from what's called the biopsychosocial model and spiritual model as well. It is a vital component to include a spiritual element into the treatment of trauma and associated mental illness. The difference is that most of the time what we're actually doing is not, there is a physical element to it, but really like what depression and anxiety are actually sort of, let's say, a distortion or an intensification of very natural responses we have to things that are very harmful and threatening to us. And what typically happens, and we can talk all about this if y'all want, is that something like anxiety, something like depression, something like let's say for myself, like complex post-traumatic stress disorder, it's sort of a sort of co-optation or a sort of, a distortion of what are typically very natural protective survival responses we have to threat and harm, especially emotional threat and harm. And so the way that we respond to those is actually this, just kind of this attempt to try to stave off a threat and to actually heal ourselves in a way and physically, somatically heal ourselves and emotionally heal ourselves in a way that because of the conditions we're in, there is no support for that. there is no way to actually give you an opportunity to sort of allow those responses to either play out how they normally would, which allows symptoms to resolve. They don't need to just be managed. You resolve symptomatology actually for a lot of mental illness. But also we're in conditions that are consistently and horribly re-traumatizing us all the time. And so in a way, it's like, it's very hard to get out of those responses whenever you're in a system, whether an economic system, a political system, or in a family system, or in a friend group, or in a social community, which is, in a way, like all responding to conditions of trauma. And what I mean by trauma is essentially anything that either directly threatens your health and well-being on a bodily level, or an emotional level, or just pushes you outside the ability you have to cope with that with whatever resources you do have.
So, in the Psychology Today article that you sent us by Michael Bader, which is a review of Johann Hari's book, Lost Connections, which I thought was, I really want to read this book now.
I highly recommend it. Highly, highly recommend it.
He essentially boils down, specifically he's talking about depression and anxiety here, but he boils down the cause of most mental illnesses, and I think he's specifically mentioning in American society, but he also, it's mostly Western society, because he does the United States and Great Britain, comes from a alienation of some sort. He doesn't talk about it in Marxist terms. In fact, he refers to it as disconnection. And I thought that was super interesting too, because this jives very well with Marxist idea of alienation. He mentioned several different categories, not the least of which was the disconnection from the ability to engage in meaningful work is one of them. And, I think we can, all of us, at least some point in our life, say that has been a source of depression for us. And it is a very large social problem. But I think that it's super interesting that that at the very beginning of the article, he talks about how he starts off with talking about pharmaceutical solutions to depression and anxiety, and how in the book, the author Hari goes a long way towards debunking the effectiveness of pharmaceutical solutions to depression and anxiety, and how there have been a lot of studies about the placebo effects of these drugs that have just been covered up. But I mean, by that I mean just like not really covered up, but just not talked about, not underscored. Because,
you don't mean like covered up. But like,
yeah, I don't mean like they've been covered up. They don't want you to know.
We got the documents, folks. We got the documents.
Pharmaceuticals. I got all the documents, but no one else has them. Just go to my website and subscribe, and you can see them too.
What about the nutraceuticals?
Well, I'm sure we are going to talk about alternative forms to psychopharmacological treatments, as Jess and I have been talking about quite a bit. So that will definitely come up, I'm sure.
Yeah, you guys gonna fucking turn into some hippies on air.
From like personal experience, in terms of the depression medication and that topic, so I have massive, horrible, major depression. I'm bipolar, so I have bipolar depression technically. And I tried like every SSRI there is existing, pretty much. I don't believe SSRIs are real. But eventually I went on Lamictal, which is what I'm on now, that has like more or less kind of cured my depression, which is insane. And I didn't think it was possible, but that's only the kind of depression where I just want to die all the time, but really for no specific reason. Whereas, and this is the same thing that kind of goes for therapy with me, where like, it's helpful, but because it doesn't change any of the conditions around me, it's just like constantly reinforced. And so if this was, I don't know, like my medication is working as good as it possibly could be, but I'm still pretty fucking bummed about the world, you know?
Yeah. And I can easily tell you what the source of my depression is. I don't like fucking need to go to a therapist to figure it out. It's because I think about certain things and then I go into a deep spiraling depression for fucking months on it. And those things are my lack of prospects for ever having a comfortable life, my lack of ever having any kind of fulfilling employment, the fact that the window for ever having a family if I ever wanted to is narrowing rapidly, stuff like that. And I'm forever going to be financially unstable. That sort of stuff makes me fucking depressed.
Well, also, like, in my experience, especially with therapy, I mean, so far, I've been in therapy for years, and I know what it is, more or less, like, you know, all of my childhood traumas that are resulting in the horrible anxiety I still have. That one's still really bad. Like, it doesn't, recognizing it for me so far and where it comes from has not helped, like, mitigate the effects of it at all. I'm every bit as anxious and as crazy as I have ever been. So, I don't know. Maybe, Adam, you have something to say about that and why, like, the effectiveness of therapy, you know, or like how it actually may be cured.
Oh, I have more than something to say about it. I have a lot to say about that.
I have the thing to say about it.
I come bringing the good news. I come bearing the good news. I will say that, unironically. So, okay, let me step back. I want to speak to something about, the typical psychopharmacological way that, like, things get treated now, and some of the, I mean, what Hari says is basically the jury is not, like, in on medications being the way to treat, like, quote unquote mental illness. So I think that, I mean, just to be super fucking nerdy about this, there are sort of three, I think, distinct, like, explanatory frameworks or, like, you know, ideologies that we can sort of adopt to kind of understand what's going on. So the dominant one is the medical model. It's basically chemical imbalances in the brain, you know, aspects of, like, neurotransmitters and such and so on and so on, and you just need to medicate those. But that approach is mostly about management. It is essentially saying, okay, you have this chemical imbalance. We're not really sure why it's there. Maybe it's genetic, whatever, but we're just going to treat that, and hopefully you will be a productive laborer. You know, you will contribute to society. You will be exploitable, right? So we're going to get you back in the workforce, or, like, have a family or something. So the second one, which is actually, I think, kind of a legacy of someone that we did talk about a little bit, whose name is Thomas Zaz, who was the sort of founder of the anti-psychiatry movement, basically said that most mental illness is actually, they're just like what he calls problems of living that are really just kind of standard things about being a human being. Also, there's some kind of, like, low-tier reactionary stuff that's part of it. But basically, it's that mental illness is essentially a labeling problem of we label certain things as mental illness, and it's essentially about power. This is a very sort of, like, Michel Foucault way to approach it. I think it actually is really helpful in contrast to the medical model. Now, the third approach that I've mentioned that I actually think is the most useful is the biopsychosocial spiritual approach of people like Gabor Mate, Bessel van der Kolk, Peter Levine. It's basically the people who are at the forefront of treating things around trauma are sort of the ones who are kind of really at the heart of this model. So basically it says that there is a complex interaction between biological factors, sociological factors, psychological, and spiritual factors. So for them, it's like, yeah, like, genetic predispositions are a thing, but those genetic expressions don't come into being unless you're in a certain environment. And actually, if you look at the studies around this stuff, things like depression, let's say, for, like, major depressive disorder, the actual studies they've done on this, the best research that we have, is you can only attribute, like, maybe 20 to 30% of depressive disorders as being very much, like, genetic or biological. The vast majority of them are responses to social conditions, like Hari talks about, or childhood trauma, which, Jess, you're talking about, and I have, like, a really significant history of. That's where mine comes from. So I think that, you know, the conditions on, like, how the medical model became the dominant one, I mean, to me, this is a great example. So take a drug like Abilify. Abilify was developed to treat schizophrenia, and it's actually very effective for symptom management for schizophrenia. So Abilify, developed for schizophrenia, right? But there is only a 1% prevalence of schizophrenia in the general population worldwide. So what happens after that 1% is medicated with Abilify? It's like, well, then you're done, right? There's no more markets to sort of break down and open up. So Abilify got itself labeled as an antidepressant treatment, and now you can market that to, like, millions upon millions of people, more than you could if they just had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. And a lot of antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications, there are really severe withdrawal effects. They might work for a little bit, but even then, the effects kind of wear off. You know, usually it's just like there is no clear, I think, indicators that these are the way to do it. Like, they've done studies where just exercising daily is actually as effective, if not more effective, for depression than most people. So, and then if we talked about things like psychedelic assisted therapies and things like that, or different treatment models, to me, it's just, there are so many different ways to look at this, but I think these things are still fairly marginal, even in the therapeutic community. Not a lot of people like do this kind of shit. So, it's a kind of a pretty radical way to look at it for most people who are part of the sort of institutions of power. And also, I think it's one that perfectly aligns with sort of a Marxist view of the world, because you have to understand that there are these individual aspects of your experience that are sort of dialectically relating to the sociological conditions. And it's that interaction that you have to understand. You have to understand it as a whole process to make sense of it.
I had a quick question. Somewhere in the Psychology Today article, like near the beginning, they were talking about basically what you were just saying, it being can be a combination of genetic and biological factors. And it said psychological events produce biological changes. Mm-hmm. And I just didn't, I wanted some elaboration on that. I did not know this.
Let's go. This is why this model is so powerful. This is why it's like bam, 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 dialectical. So one of the things that we know about how the brain and body develop is that certain events that happen will literally change how your brain and nervous system operate and develop. So there's something called Hebb's law, which is really key here. And the idea is that neurological patterns that like fire together based on the environment that you're in literally wire your brain and neural pathways to operate in a certain way. The most amazing thing about the cutting edge treatments that are out there is that, yes, that is true. Like biological predispositions will allow certain things that if they fire together enough will lead to like very strong predispositions to depression and anxiety. But the really amazing thing, and keep in mind what I'm about to say, is regardless of age, if you approach this stuff in the right way and use this knowledge and this framework, you can actually get to a point where your mind can operate in a way that it will literally reshape how your neurological pathways function and fire together. Most of what I would call effective treatment, especially for trauma related things, which to me, I think the pathway into having a corporeal body is trauma. I think birth is inherently traumatizing. So for me, everyone is traumatized. That is not a joke. I mean that very sincerely. But what essentially happens is that your mind can literally reshape how your nervous system and your brain actually operate in the environment itself. And so it's kind of this dialectical process of how these two things are informing each other. And I think really effective treatments actually help you learn how to shape that in a way that can actually lead to effective, dare I say, resolution of things like anxiety and depression, or at least they're way the fuck more effective than what most people are doing, which is usually trying to just, CBT your way out of understanding that the world is on fire, which is, there's a reason why most people find that completely offensive and counterproductive.
Right. This is what alchemy is for.
Yes.
Right? That's what it actually is. And it's not taken seriously when people hear, I think for the same reason why most things aren't taken seriously, because it seems like it's impossible to make oneself better. But also because I think what the last thing you said, Adam, which is whether it's consciously foregrounded in a person's mind, or if it's merely an implicit understanding that occurs from just existing in the world, just changing yourself all by itself, that's not enough, because the world still acts on you and you still act upon the world. And the world is terrible, right? And everybody knows the world is terrible, even when they don't know that they know.
Adam, I read this book several years ago. It's called Spark by John Rady. He's a psychiatrist at Harvard Medical School, clinical professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. That's who he is. But he was experimenting using, along with all the other traditional treatments of mental illnesses, using exercise as part of a prescription. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that he found is that eventually he could wean people off of antidepressants and stuff by, doing guided exercise with them. And one of the things that you said about forging neural pathways is the things that reaction to trauma being a healthy response of your body's fight or flight reaction, right? So it creates it gives you a solid a place in your mind that's a memory that is supposed to teach you to not do whatever it was that caused this trauma to happen to you again. It's an evolutionary response to, like, being attacked by a fucking wildcat or something. So, don't go in that canyon anymore. And then your fight or flight response kicks in. And generally you have that release of chemicals that's caused by running away very quickly that allows the cortisol levels to be counteracted. And what we do is we have the traumas when we don't have that release of the chemicals that counteract cortisol. And therein, the buildup of cortisol causes like high levels of stress and everything else. And that leads to mental illnesses, so-called, right? So that exercising regularly can help counteract those levels of cortisol. And whenever I was at the lowest point of my life and incredibly depressed, I read this book because someone suggested it to me. And I began exercising like a madman to the point where I would like injure myself because I was exercising so much. But I wasn't sad.
Well, I think there's something really important here. And I want to come back to what you were saying too, Jess, about...
And you got real fit.
I did. I was like 50 pounds.
And you got fucking swole and jacked. Which, in a way, like a lot of mental illness in the approach that I use for treatment and what I found to be most helpful is, just to kind of throw this out there, it's an approach that's called internal family systems. And to me, it's just like hands down, I don't think there's anything better personally. But a lot of what y'all are talking about is kind of hitting on why this approach is effective. So let me kind of speak to kind of both of what you all are saying. So Jess, you were talking about, you can be in therapy for years and having insight after insight and understanding like the narrative of like, well, why do I feel this way? Where did it come from? That being said, that's important, but it's like a necessary but insufficient condition, because a lot of what traumas do to us is literally on the level of our body and nervous system and brain. And so if we don't have a way to help forge new ways of processing experience of ourselves and the world around us, all the insight in the world isn't going to cure that. And so let me talk about this with depression in particular. I think is really important for like definitely a communist like Marxist perspective. So the way that our brains work, there's this very important aspect of how our brains work that's called the default mode network. Have y'all ever heard of this before? Okay, so the default mode network is kind of like let's call him the conductor of the symphony that is your brain. It's kind of the part that is always running in the background, that it's always kind of saying, who am I? What am I doing? What is the world? How do I fit into the world? Like, how does that tell me who I am? A lot of times with things like depression in particular, and if you include trauma, it's a pretty surefire bet that this is going to happen. Your default mode network, what it learns from not just trauma, but also social conditions under capitalism with exploited, labor, being hyper alienated from everything, the environment, each other, ourselves. That default mode network very often starts to tell itself a story. It tells you a story. And that story is you are worthless, you mean nothing, you're lesser than, you're a failure, you're disgusting, you don't deserve to exist. So let me share something with y'all about me. So I have struggled earlier in life until actually not that long ago. I'm very, very happy and proud and like humbled to say this, with a lot of self-harm and suicidality stuff, right? And that's related to depression. And a lot of the time, the story that's happening at the level of your default mode network is literally a story that like, I'm a mistake. I don't deserve to exist. I don't deserve to be here. Why am I here? How do I make sense of any of this? So a lot of times I treat people with complex trauma, high levels of suicidality, self-harm, all sorts of compulsive behaviors that are related to ways that we're trying to deal with this fundamental lie that we've been taught by a system that is hyper traumatizing and brutal, which then gets filtered down into our families and into our social context, which basically it's just like so brilliantly tuned to basically traumatize you and teach you that you do not fucking matter. I think that's at the end of the day, like what all this is about. And what our default mode networks do is they start to play that story in the background 24 hours a day. One way to understand what depression is it's essentially a default mode network that has gotten locked into living on this sort of deceit, and it doesn't know how to break out of it because it's so like firmly ingrained in every element of your life and experience that it's hard to know how to deal with it. It's like almost impossible. So, there's this idea that what depression is in this model that I sort of worked from, that I found most helpful for myself, is that a lot of the time, the conditions that we're in, traumatizing, or even if you don't identify as having trauma, provoke intense rage, intense rage, which is a protective survival function. And so a lot of the time, if we're in an environment where to express rage is to bring about greater harm to yourself, or there's just like, it's not going to change anything, what we do instead is we go to our next lower level of defenses, which is operating out of what we call the dorsal vagal system in our nervous systems. And it basically shuts everything down. And it says, well, what's the point of fighting back against any of this? Because we're helpless. It's not going to change anything. And not only that, if I fight back about it, maybe I'm going to get hurt even worse, or I'm going to feel even more alienated. So we have this finely tuned, evolutionarily developed nervous system and brain that understands that if we can't fight back against a system or a condition that is actually harming us, the next best thing to do is to go down to shutdown mode, which is, for a lot of us, that's what depression is. And it's literally like a suppression of rage and anger about being fucking traumatized and being in these conditions that are profoundly destructive to human life and to just life and the environment and the planet in general. So for me, I think that's why this perspective fits so beautifully with a Marxist kind of worldview and like framework, because it's basically saying, well, of course, in the system and your subjective conditions, well, like it would make all the sense in the world that if you can't fight back and change it, like, well, what's the next best way to survive? Well, shut down. Feel depressed and then feel anxious because of the fact that you're constantly under threat 24 hours a day. And that all gets locked into this default mode network. And then all of a sudden we're like, hey, I feel really depressed. I feel really anxious. Like, what do I do about it? And then someone says, oh, well, here's a pill. Or, oh, get CBT and just change the way you think. And then you'll feel better about yourself. And it's like, is it any wonder why most of us are like, fuck medications and fuck therapy?
Right. Like the fury and disgust that you feel at a world without passion, that is crushing you and is alienating and denies that even your desire to live in a world that feels meaningful and worth being alive for, that desire itself is what needs to go away. And so that's what people hear when they hear, well, let's say this, I'll say it this way. That's what I hear when I talk about the way I feel about the world. And someone says, oh, well, have you tried, SSRIs? Or also, that's kind of what I hear sometimes when I hear people say, get a new hobby, or like go jogging. It's like, yes, those things are all palliatives and they could be helpful a little bit, and in a lot of cases they're necessary in order to keep you functioning. And we all want each other to function. But very, very rarely do I ever hear anything on the level of this conversation already, which is just like, yeah, doctor, it hurts when I do this. Exist under a capitalist regime. That's the problem. And but so that was all leading up to a question though, because what about the flip side of this? Because I do often hear that as the solution, which is just like, what are you going to do? Capitalism is crushing you to death, and it hurts and it feels bad.
Before you answer that, Adam, I just wanted to go off of what you were just talking about, and then I think it'll flow pretty well into answering that question. Is that like one of the things that I was going to say about like when I was exercising regularly in order to help with my depression. One of the things that I had problems with when I was younger was extreme rage. I used to break things, punch holes in walls, do like real Kyle shit, right? Because that's the way that I dealt with like, my traumas from like childhood and whatever. So like in the process of, I went to therapy, and one of the things that I realized when I was in therapy, and this is one of the things that therapy is useful for, is helping me understand that my responses to things that seem like totally benign, that I shouldn't be mad about, that I have like real valid reasons for responding to them the way that I do, and that I should recognize that when I start to respond this way, that it is, I'm not responding to what it is that's happening. I'm responding to whatever the fuck it was that happened to me in the past, right? So that was helpful for like putting things into a context, and then reducing my not just reacting on instinct and sort of trying to like logically work my way out of that. and that, and like the exercise that I was talking about, I think like really helped change my brain chemistry so that I'm a different person now than I was before I went through that. And I think that pretty much anybody knows me will tell you that I don't respond in the same way that I did to things back then at all. It's like my rage problem is essentially evaporated, but the depression about existence problem has actually deepened. And that's something that it just doesn't go away. I'm just constantly depressed all the fucking time. Sometimes it's worse. Sometimes it's, not so bad. But I know that there is a predisposition towards depression in my family. Jason's always fucking depressed, right? And so is my mom,
Thanks, bro.
Yeah, no problem. But like I kind of lost my train of thought.
Just do like me and keep rambling until it sounds like you're trying to make a point.
Yeah. But okay, so like, I think that like there was like therapy was useful for helping me like sort of identify things and sort of try to change my reactions to them, but it didn't change the reasons why those things happened. And I think that the reasons why those things happened were because of, I don't want to get too personal here, bad situations that people were in and the stresses that people were under that I think I can directly relate to economic situation my family was in when we were younger. And I think that like being able to exist under capitalism means that we're going to have to try to figure out ways to cope with the things that are happening without losing the disgust and the critique we have of the system, right? So like therapy, drugs, exercise, all of that stuff is good for helping us not kill ourselves, but it doesn't address the problem. And I guess that was my point.
Jess, Kevin, you don't have thoughts before I fucking just completely go galaxy brain on this shit?
I was just gonna say, y'all need Jesus.
Y'all motherfuckers need Jesus.
That's it.
I personally have a closer
Chad,
relationship
yes.
with tears. Yeah. I mean, I've been to therapy and like a couple times, and look, psychology, psychoanalysis, therapy, whatever. This kind of stuff has never been a part of anything that I've ever known about anything in the world. So my approach to finding a therapist was log into my insurance provider, see who is in network, and just like go and who's accepting new patients. Which the last time I did this, there was literally one person who was accepting new patients and in network. And then there were others, but all of them you had to be referred by a physician. And so this was the only one that was that my physician, that was my general practitioner, whatever, my primary care physician, was referring to. So anyway, I went to this one therapist. They did CBT. I felt like, I went to it because I was in a place in my life where I was dealing with suicidality in a very real way, and to the point not where it was a sort of background lingering thought, but to the point where I was starting to think about acting things out and trying to make plans for how to make it come to fruition. And it was enough that it really scared me into like, I need to do something about this. So I went to therapy. My experience with it was very underwhelming. Like I felt like the therapist was trying to help me see that my thoughts were not rational, and I didn't have words to articulate it sort of back to the therapist or anything like that. But what I felt in sort of retrospect, I've thought about it, and like my sense is just that I wanted to say, I know this isn't rational. That's the fucking problem. Like I'm not, this is happening. This shit is happening in my brain, and it's not like I think that this is the correct course of thoughts, and therefore I'm having this course of thoughts. It's just this, my brain is just doing this, and I need help to get out of this cycle, whatever the cycle is that I'm in. Now, some conditions changed in my life, and I definitely got healthier and ended up just stopped going to therapy. But I never felt like I had any productive development in dialogue with that therapist.
I think one of the big assumptions underlying most mental health treatment is a very Cartesian, dualistic sort of worldview. I mean, these are problems of ontology and philosophy to me. Like, if you really want to do therapy, we have to talk about, I mean, I think there are multiple levels it has to work on. It's like, I think sometimes you need to take a heroic dose level of mushrooms and get your fucking astral body retuned. And then other times you need to like understand, how have I internalized the Cartesian worldview where my thoughts are completely separate and seen as being superordinate to my emotional and bodily experiences. So this is a fundamental deadlock that I think is a major part of like what you experience, Kevin. So I remember the last therapist I worked with, I am a therapist, right? And so, which is always a fun dynamic, being a therapist and doing therapy. But I remember I sat down, I was like, listen, I'm a communist. And if you and I cannot talk very openly about climate catastrophe, this is not going to work. Like, you cannot CBT me out of this. You cannot like try to convince me that this is just a way I need to change my thoughts. It's like, that is not going to work. And I know it's not going to work. And there's, I have the credentials to kind of like back up that I know it's not going to work. And I think that that's, Kevin, what you're speaking to is exactly this other approach that I'm talking about. Changing your like thought patterns is important, right? That is an element of all of this. That's part of the the holistic sort of dialectical kind of approach. But the thing is that most of our thought patterns they're not driving the car. Like, our emotional and somatic bodily experiences tend to happen like microseconds before we actually have a cognitive rational thought about it. Now, the cognitive rational thoughts can, sort of also influence our emotional and bodily reactions. But if the only way you think that you have to deal with like living in a fucking world that is just collapsing and is on fire is like this Cartesian worldview of like, oh, well, your thoughts are really all that matters. Change your thinking to change yourself. Again, it's like, to me, it's like, it's not totally wrong, but it just leaves out like 75% of what actually is happening whenever someone is walking in and they're like, I'm thinking about suicide. I feel horribly depressed. And I think that a lot of people, even on the left, whenever they talk about this, or especially around addiction as well, is that like, we just don't have like a full picture. It's like we're kind of Marxist or like dialectical whenever it comes to like the most personal shit in our day-to-day lives. And then it's like we have a very hard time, I think, having a different way to think about things. And also, Jess, I do agree. I think, all of us motherfuckers need Jesus too. I think there has to be a spiritual component to this if you want it to actually capture like what it is to be a human being and to not be alienated. I think it's an absolutely essential part of this. And most of the people I know on the left, it's like, it's just, we don't gain anything by not having it. And I think we actually fall prey into the sort of like imperialist, colonialist like mindset by thinking that that is something separate from what we're talking about.
Yeah. I remember like as a former atheist and someone who has to talk to atheists sometimes, now they love to say, they like typically love to say that thing about, well, if it makes other people feel better, then that's fine, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, yeah, that's kind of like, that's great though. It's not just fine. And I think it's sad that you don't have that. Like, it does make me feel better. You know what I mean? Like, and I don't think there's going to be much longer that me and Adam can avoid starting to talk about psychedelics here. So I'm just going to mention it. Recently, one of the times I did mushrooms this week, I like absolutely had a moment of like oneness with God, and it genuinely made me feel better post doing mushrooms. Like, I'm not saying that under any conditions do I think that or any level of spirituality or belief that I have or amount of magic that I do, that it's going to make me feel better about the climate catastrophe, for example. But it does seem to, I don't know, I actually really don't know how to describe it, but in a way it helps.
Yeah,
Well,
look, that's, so I sort of stumbled my way toward a question that I don't think I really properly asked, which is, so Jess, you kind of teed it up to give me another shot at it, I think, which is that sometimes I feel like a recognition of the social nature of trauma and the social causes of depression and anxiety and what we call mental illness, which up until doing some reading for this conversation, I had never even heard an alternative for mental illness. But a recognition of the social nature of these things sometimes often appears to me to be like a way of waving away treatment, therapy, whatever it is that we try to do for ourselves. The thing people say about like the misquoting of Marx, the religion is the opiate of the masses, right? And then the best that people can say about it is like, well, yeah, opium, it helps, dull pain or whatever. See, this is not a properly formulated question. The question is, how do we counter, or how do we not just put ourselves in a position of just being like, oh, well, what can you do? Capitalism sucks, makes everything bad.
Okay, so thank you. This is exactly where I was hoping we would go with this. Okay, so let me say that this biopsychosocial spiritual model, why I think it's so important, especially if you're committed to any sort of like radical left revolutionary politics. I think that most of what we experience in what you're talking about, Jason, and also kind of Jess, I think you're talking about this as well, is that a lot of the time we take the internalization of external conditions which shape how we think about who we are and what our place is in the world, and it fundamentally alienates us from whatever capacities we do have to change ourselves and to sort of work with each other and build solidarity for anything, even if it's just, to survive in the like irradiated landscapes, like post-collapse, right? I think the thing is that if we just say, well, it's just capitalism, what can you do? Fundamentally accepts the very conditions which capitalism gives us, which make us feel anxious and depressed. In my opinion, like the dialectical pessimist, revolutionary pessimist, sort of alchemical hermetic approach, to me, these are all the same thing as what it is to heal. Like, I really do believe that. I think that these are all different aspects of one process of alchemical, subjective, objective transformation that we're kind of we've been like wrestling with across, the episodes that we've all done together, I think. So for me, I think the real thing to take from all of this is to say, okay, so now you're telling me that there are ways that if I want to not internalize these conditions so much, then like there's something I can do. And not only that, but if I start doing this, it might actually help me know what it means to be non-alienated from myself, because I think that trauma is like the deepest alienation from the self in the world and nature. And then it will actually help me actually connect and not be alienated from you as well. So there's this line from the Gospel of Thomas, which says, know yourself and then you shall be known, and then you will know that you are a child of God. And until then, you live in poverty and you are the poverty. And I think that this is exactly the conditions we find ourselves in under capitalism. And it's like, what do we do with that? And I think that part of this is like, we have to figure out what it means to not be alienated by any means necessary. And then maybe we can actually start to figure out like, wow, maybe we aren't as powerless as capitalism has told us. Because I think a lot of the time we do just like give it up to external conditions and completely negate the subjective element of all of this. And I'm not saying it's like sufficient or it's like some lifestyle anarchist bullshit where it's like, oh, just like be vegan and like shop at the right places and that's the revolution. I'm not saying that. But the truth is we have a problem, which is we're in this spot and we have to figure out what it actually means to like not be alienated from ourselves and each other. And I think that like to me, all these like different things together are like all ways we're trying to figure out how to do that. And I think that there is hope beyond accepting the hopelessness of the conditions you're in. And I think that's what this is about, is to say there is something to do. And it's hard and it's alchemical in nature, but there is something to do. And it might actually be the same thing as learning how to heal from the very conditions that have traumatized us so much.
If Mir was here, he would want to burn you as a heretic for quoting Gnostic Gospels there, Adam.
I literally told my mom the other day, I was like, hey, I am a Christian. I'm just a heretic. So... So, all right, I
was going to say, You sounded very, I didn't realize that you're quoting specifically Gnostic Gospels, but I was going to say you're sounding very Gnostic as opposed to Hermetic.
Well,
There's a lot of
no.
crossover there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say, in Hermeticism, like main tenet, know thyself. It's almost the exact same thing you said. Yeah.
Yeah, and like a lot of modern Gnostics actually include the Corpus Hermeticum in their like inspired texts.
That makes sense. That definitely makes sense. I mean, they're both mystical traditions, but I'm just thinking back to our way off topic, but whatever. I'm just thinking back to our reading of the text on Hegel and Hermeticism, and the distinction between Gnosticism was that Gnosticism seeks to sees the alienation as impurity or like that's the flaw that's it's seeking to overcome and resolve. Hermeticism sees alienation as the completion of God.
I would disagree with that, actually. I would say that Hermeticism would say that the alienation and the fall is necessary for the eventual dialectical unity of separateness and unity at the same time.
Yeah.
There are probably even starker differences, though, like in between Hermeticism and Gnosticism. In Gnosticism, matter equals bad, and then in Hermeticism, there's not this negative value judgment applied to the existence of matter.
Yeah, it's like matter bad? Maybe. Let's see what happens. And then it's like, no, actually matter is good.
Yeah. Which is, I can jive with that a lot better than I can with the Gnostic conception of...
totally.
I agree. Well,
matter is good sometimes.
Sometimes matter do be like that, yo.
Yeah.
So, Jess, I actually want to share something since you brought up psychedelics I think is really crucial here. You know, in a way, I think that if we compare, let's say, the emerging sort of paradigm of like psychedelics for the treatment of mental health conditions, especially depression, anxiety, trauma, substance use, addiction, I mean, who knows what else. You know, one of the things that they're finding is that, let's say, for example, someone takes a very high grade, like, or very like heroic dose level amount of psilocybin mushrooms, right? Well, one of the things that they're finding is that default mode network, which typically is the thing that keeps like that depressive sort of feeling of yourself in the world in place, is it literally gets in there and just disrupts the hell out of it and almost allows you to sort of reconfigure new neural pathways. And you have to have the default mode network being disrupted to do that. Now, one of the things that I'm a huge proponent of is the use of MDMA for the treatment of complex trauma and associated mental illness, right? So, for example, they just completed a phase 3 study where on basically the VA's PTSD symptomatology like assessment tool that they use that tells you like, here's how bad you have PTSD, right? In 3 sessions of MDMA assisted therapy, people have gone from like maxed out on the symptoms on this chart to literally having none, or like at least being out of clinical range. And that will hold for at least like 9 months to a year. So think about the amount of suicide, depression, the just complete destruction of your way of life if you've suffered PTSD of some kind, and all of a sudden someone says, hey, listen, there is this other kind of tool that we could use that in 3 sessions in like a couple of months, you could very likely, if not have like symptom resolution, at least have such a reduction in symptoms that you can actually like connect to the world and not constantly feel like you're about to die. You know, I mean, these things are like amazing, and there's a very strong reason why all these drugs were made Schedule 1 back in the 60s and 70s. It's because like how do you develop a pharmaceutical industry around drugs that can basically say, oh, we can like help you in like 3 sessions, like not have to like take a drug for the rest of your life. I mean, there's a lot of like materialist aspects of this. But on a personal note, you know, I remember, so after my first like solo MDMA experience focused on therapeutic sort of work, I remember, so I've struggled with depression like my whole life, and complex trauma, which is kind of what it came from. And I've been like doing a lot of work and like making progress, and things were like getting better. And I did this experience after doing a lot of research on how it could be helpful. And I remember it was the day after, and you know, there's this notorious like sort of like serotonin drop that happens after you do MDMA. And like a lot of people, you can feel very depressed the day after. So I remember I was walking, taking a walk after I started to feel depressed. And I was like, okay, I knew this might happen. And So keep in mind that MDMA, one of the ways that you experience it is it's kind of like, it basically takes things that you typically have intense fear around and avoid having any sort of experience of. And it basically, like a light switch, just shuts that off, and it maximizes your ability to have compassion and understanding for other beings, but also for yourself, right? So with trauma, this is like why it's so powerful, because most of the time we avoid everything and anything that reminds us of the traumatic event. And that's like a physical, somatic nervous system thing. So I was taking a walk and I started to feel depressed, and I was like sitting down by the pool at my old apartment. And I remember it just like kind of hit me. That was like, so MDMA does this very fascinating thing where it makes you very, very curious about things. Whenever you do it in this therapeutic way, I'm not like, people can do it and like go to raves and shit. Like that's fine. Recreational drug use is fine. But in this therapeutic sort of way, it makes you very like intensely introspective, and from this like lens of being very, very self-compassionate, which is kind of what you need if you've been through trauma. So I was sitting there and I started to feel depressed, and I was just like, okay, so I can either be depressed right now and I can just like give into this, or I can be curious about it and try to figure out what's going on. Like, why is this happening? I was like, is it just brain chemistry? Like, what's the deal, you know? And I remember I just got like very curious, and all of a sudden I realized, because you literally feel that you are completely alone in the universe. You literally feel that no matter what happens, no matter who you ever meet, no matter what you ever do, you will always be alone. And I remember I just kind of sat there and I'm just like, that is like the dumbest fucking thing I have ever thought about in my entire life. And I remember I literally looked and I saw all these trees swaying in the wind. It was at night. And I just literally had this visceral experience. It wasn't a thought. It was like a visceral somatic shift that I literally just sat there and I was like, there are 7 billion people on this planet, and look at all the life that's around you all the time. And it was like, no matter what happens, you will never be alone in the way that you think you are. Like you never have been, you never could be. I shit you not. Like that, immediately I felt something that I never felt in my entire life, and I have not been depressed a day since.
Wow.
Holy shit.
Yeah. So I'm not saying
You hear that, kids? Drugs are good.
Drugs are good, done in a very healthy, therapeutic way. So again, I'm not saying that's going to be the case for everybody. It took a lot of prep work, and also I'm a therapist, and so I had a lot of tools to use. But to me, it was one of those moments where it was like, oh yeah, my life will never be the same after that. Because it was like something I felt. I didn't just think about, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds a lot like well, whatever. I mean, I think it sounds really resonant with like descriptions of enlightenment, of a realization of oneness that changes who you are and the way that you understand yourself in the world.
I think that's kind of what Jess, you were saying too. I think that's kind of, in some ways, like that's kind of what a lot of us need. It's like we literally need something that so fundamentally cuts to the heart of like that feeling of alienation and separateness from ourselves, and from everything. It's like, I think they can just be very powerful tools for getting you a place where it's like, oh yeah, like we're going to just completely retool how you feel and experience separateness. And, for me, it's just been kind of life-changing. So.
Yeah. This last year, year and a half has been a very tough one for me. And, what I have found is that, meditation and, this conversation we're having about like sort of practiced, controlled, deliberate, sort of use of particular drugs for particular reasons in certain ways. I have found those to be just immensely helpful. And not just in a way that like, oh, I'm distracted for a little bit, right? But like closer to like what you're talking about, Adam. It's just like in ways that I didn't previously believe were actually possible and never took seriously. Like when people talked about these things, I regarded it as sort of silly woo-woo shit or whatever. The thing is, I have come to embrace a lot of silly woo-woo shit, so that's helped a lot. So there is a mental preparedness for it that matters too. And I have found that the overwhelming majority of lefty types that I know haven't got the time for it still. Because what they have to say is, well, the capitalism's terrible, the world's terrible, so that's just how it's going to be. So what you do instead is you go out, get drunk, have some light conversation to like distract yourself from how terrible you feel, and then wake up in the morning and start over every day of your life.
So, Jess, I'm curious if you would agree with what I'm about to say here. So for me, these experiences, in a way, are, like, to me, the closest thing I've gotten to what it feels like to actually live by the values of, like, being a fucking communist or like a hermetical alchemist or whatever. Like, just to me, whenever I think about all the, like, leftist politics I've been involved in, that's exactly what I see, Jason. It's like I see all of us just completely resigning ourselves to the conditions and, like, waving them away. You know, the truth is my experiences, not just in therapy, but also in combination with doing very certain types of, like, substances that can lead to these effects, like, it helps me feel like I actually am more connected and more political and more radical, and am actually, in a way, like, feel like I'm actively putting those things into practice in a way that isn't just me talking a bunch of shit, but, like, no, like, I literally feel this on a physical somatic level, and I'm going to do my best to try to, like, move something in the world that might actually, you know, help us be the manure of history, right? As we've talked about. Like, for me, it's like, this isn't an intellectual enterprise. It's like, this is literally, I mean, it's kind of what Rilke said, like, you must change your life. Like, it is that deadly serious. And I think, you know, to me, it's like these substances, like, doing it this way has helped me heal, like, treat mental health issues, but also, like, just feel, like, more in touch with what it is to be, like, a quote unquote communist or like a Marxist. Because for me, it's like, oh yeah, this is like how you look at the world if you really believe that stuff on, like, a physical level.
Yeah, I agree. And it's, for me, I tend to, and have been for a while, like, isolating myself really bad, especially if I'm, like, particularly depressed or particularly anxious. I don't want to, like, engage with my friends. I don't want to engage with anything, really. I want to go home and go down my anxiety spiral and just be miserable for whatever reason. And that affects, you know, all areas of my life. Obviously, it contributes to me being more depressed and more anxious, but it also removes me from my friendships and community and just other human beings. And that was something that came to me pretty heavily when I was on mushrooms, where I just, along with experiencing this, like, as I described it, moment of oneness with God, and if in my belief or whatever, God is all of us, we are all God, and so on. So it made me feel a hyper connection to those around me. And I don't know where I'm going with that, but that's sort of how it's affected me in that way, I think, is that it's made me feel more connected rather than just, like, me being miserable in my house about how horrible my life is and how horrible the world is, which it is.
Well, Adam, I really appreciated what you said about how this helps you. You feel like this helps you be a better communist, you know? And Jess, I was just thinking about, like, how what the culture of the left is in this present moment is people being self-isolated or just isolated, like everybody else in the entire society, but all, you know, isolated together, right? And angrily shitposting and canceling and having flame wars and trying to purify the world through this, like, sort of dumping of this visceral rage on each other. And yeah, how could we be good communists if that's our default
Absolutely.
mode? You know?
We can't. So we aren't.
And look around. We're not.
Yes.
Yes, we all suck ass.
Well, you know, in a way, though, like, what I love about this, and, like, why I think the alchemical hermetic approach is so important is, you know, in a way, we are all fallen, right? And we have to start there. You know, whenever we look around at each other, or like, oh, you're a Posadist, and I'm like a, you know, like, Third International Trotskyist or whatever. You know, these are all ways that, like, we find very good reasons to do something with all this rage, you know, or all this just complete despair. And, like, for me, I think, you know, we have to hold, I'm going to sound like a fucking Buddhist now, but, like, so be it. Like, I think we have to hold a certain level of compassion for ourselves and for the other people, that, like, we are all dealing with being fallen and part of this massive, most brutal, torturous economic and political system that the world has ever seen. And I think we have to, like, recognize that and acknowledge that, and also know that there has to be, like, the fall upwards, right? That is precisely through these conditions that we've experienced, that we have to figure out a way to, you know, find, like, I don't say hope, but something at the end of hopelessness that is somehow the thing that allows us to realize like there's this dialectical reversal that can happen where we actually find what it means to be connected. And that actually is more powerful because we've been so alienated from each other. And I think that that's really kind of the implication of this kind of stuff for mental illness, treatment, healing, and like communist politics. It's like, I don't know what it means to be a communist if I can't like look over at like any of you and see you as separate, but also as identity and as like unity, right? And to know that like we're all part of something much bigger, right? And in a way, like for us to just resign ourselves to like shit posting and like, you know, rage screaming at each other on Facebook about what, you know, a debate from like the 19 teens, just to me is like just us resigning ourselves to being fallen. And I don't know, I think to be a communist is to, you know, aspire to something much greater than that.
Yeah, you know, it might feel cathartic to vent and take out our traumas on each other, but catharsis is kind of revolutionary.
Yeah, and it's actually just reinforces the very conditions that traumatize us in the first place.
Catharsis is kind of revolutionary, and optimism is cowardice.
Yeah. Adam, I think you just perfectly
T-shirt.
defined dialectical pessimism, for me at least, when you said there is something at the end of hopelessness, that to resign ourselves to total hopelessness would simply be pessimism. But, you know, we assert a dialectical turn on pessimism at some point. There is something at the end of hopelessness. We wouldn't call it hope, but there is something at the end of hopelessness.
I have totally tripped balls on repetitive prayer and meditating on an icon.
Hell yeah. I've definitely had some nights in deep meditation where it's gotten pretty fucking psychedelic. And I mean, you know, these are all technologies. They're all technologies of how to get to a certain state of consciousness, which overcomes separateness in a way. I mean, that's why it's like, you know, there's this story that the Buddha told, or it's about the Buddha. It's like, he comes across some guy and the guy's like, oh, hey, you know, I've been like meditating and doing all these techniques. And after like 30 years, I can like walk across water. And the Buddha's like, well, why didn't you just take the ferry though? It's like 5 cents. You know, it's like we're all
I'm not against aiding in that I just don't for myself personally want to do that, you know?
Yeah. I don't think it's everyone's cup of tea either. Like that's the other thing. Like I was telling someone I was like, ego death is not for everybody. Like, I don't necessarily think everyone needs to have ego death, but if you find that you are intrigued by ego death, then this might be the path for you. So.
Find out if ego death is right for you.
Call your physician. Ask your physician if ego death is right for you.
Yeah, I mean, like, all of the Western meditative practices have very similar parallels in the Eastern ones as well. I think a lot of people miss that. When I say Western, I mean, I include like Eastern Orthodox and, Catholicism. And to a certain extent, even Protestantism has like these deep meditative euphoric practices that I know like monks will do repetitive prayer all day long in order to reach ecstatic states. And I'm sure you're familiar with hesychasm, right? In the Eastern Orthodox tradition, which is to say the Jesus prayer over and over again, and over and over and over and over all day long, while you're doing everything that you do. There are reams and reams of materials of people of their fucking acid trips caused by like praying to God over and over again.
Yeah, I mean,
and I've had a few of those.
Yeah, I mean, like, what is Jacob Boehme's like the way to Christ, if not like one very long acid trip from prayer? I mean, I will say, like, you know, one of the things that I think all the neurobiological research is showing is actually these practices of prayer, meditation, psychedelics can be part of that. All these different approaches literally are the very way that you learn to harness that like state of mind, which allows you to reshape neurobiology in your nervous system. That's kind of what they're showing. And it's like pretty clear. I treat people based on this. I have done work and been treated based on this. I've yet to find anything that's actually as effective. And I think that's what these like spiritual traditions knew, is they understood that, you know, the inner landscape and the mind is this tool to reshape and refashion reality and the body itself. You know, which sounds at first like woo-woo bullshit, but then you're like, oh, but wait a minute there. If you want to know, if you care about science, literally this is what all the scientific research is showing. This is what works. This is why it works. And it is very alchemical in nature that literally being in a certain state of consciousness and practicing these techniques in certain ways literally can reshape like your body and your mind.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, it's like, okay, cool. Yeah. So everyone do drugs, everyone do alchemy and magic, everyone do yoga. I don't care. Whatever you want to do is fine, but like find some way to engage in some sort of practice or technology that allows you to do that. Because if you don't, I think then what are you left with? Rage posting on Facebook, just getting shit-faced every night, right? Or just going to work at your job feeling horribly depressed and anxious. I mean, to me, it's just like, there is something to be done. There is something to be done. And to me, I wouldn't call that hope, but whatever it is, I think that's kind of for me, what the real lesson has been. It's like, oh, there are things to do. So get your ass to work.
I like how we've all, like, every single one of us has some sort of spiritual practice that is like divergent from each other's, but we've all linked up with Hegelian Hermeticism.
Hey, listen,
Well,
the Lord Shiva said in the Bhagavad Gita, there are many paths to the same top of the mountain, you know?
Yeah. That's a
was
very
gonna
hermetic way
say-
to look at it.
Yeah, it's almost like it's all the same shit.
yeah, it's almost like each of us has really only sort of a view of a one particular aspect, but not yet the whole. You know, and you can't grasp the whole until you appreciate all the aspects individually and also how they interact with each other.
I had a Catholic priest tell me one time, like, I asked him, sorry, does you think Christianity has a monopoly on truth? And he said, no, but I think it's just the quickest route. I was like, fair enough. I think you're allowed to have that belief.
Yeah.
My view of this is very fucking Jungian. Like, I see
Totally getting fucking canceled. Fucking reactionary.
No, but I see like the way that we relate to the divine is completely bound up in what archetypes resonate with us the most, right?
Yeah.
And for me, it's very, very Christian. Do I believe all of the Christians? No. Does like Christian iconography and like Christian liturgy and, you know, smells and bells resonate with me incredibly deeply in a way that helps me like experience the divine? Yeah. So, I mean, that's the way I do it. And I think that we're so far off topic here.
Are we though? Are we?
No,
though?
I guess we're not.
But in
No.
in a sense, yes, but it's
But also no.
All right, I got a pro podcast to move. Oh, ready?
Do it.
Why is what we just talked about not totally unrelated? Because I think we're sort of talking about mental illness, quote unquote, as like an experience of alienation. So one of the readings that I sent y'all to check out was Turn Illness into a Weapon by the SPK. Have y'all ever heard of the SPK before? I sent that reading to y'all.
I'd
No.
never heard of it, no.
So basically it was, it's the Socialist Patients Collective. It was a group that kind of emerged in Germany, I think like 1970, but basically it was part of this sort of welding together of like anti-psychiatry, anti-capitalism, you know, especially in that particular period. But one of the things that they talk about in this book, it's kind of like a very long pamphlet, I guess. It's about like 150 pages. But in the part that I sent for y'all to read, they're talking about the nature of like mental illness as like the symptom of capitalism, because essentially they're saying this is where like the contradiction between life and death like play out most dialectically. And it's basically the idea that alienation is the symptom of capitalism. And they quote, which I hadn't read this in a while, but in this conversation, the context of this, I think it's actually like, it's pretty hot fire, but they have this quote from the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844 by Marx and Engels. And they say, communism is the positive transcendence of private property, which is human self-alienation and therefore is actual appropriation of the human essence by and for humans, therefore is the complete conscious return within the whole realm of his previous development of becoming of the human for itself as a social, i.e. human being. this communism is as completed naturalism equals humanism as completed humanism equals naturalism, which is just such fucking Chad shit to write that sentence. But I think that in a way, like what we're kind of talking about and why it fits in with this sort of Marxist perspective is that this sort of dialectical movement is about, in a way, it's like very hermetic, and you can see where Marx was taking these sort of like hermetic elements of Hegel, is that the alienation happens, and it's through that alienation that we then sort of reappropriate human essence for the first time in a conscious way. And I think that a lot of what we're talking about with like mental illness and healing and treatment and like what is this really all about is literally this sort of process on the level of like the psyche, let's say. It's this experience of being horribly traumatized and alienated under the capitalist system, and then somehow finding a way to reappropriate like whatever human essence is in this sort of like dialectically reversed way. So, I mean, to me, it's like, it's all one big thing, man. You know, it's just like different elements of the same process playing out at different levels of, you know, material reality, I guess.
Yeah. You know, Marx does that in other instances too, that I think are just, they go unappreciated. Like, the distinction between, the objective existence of a proletariat or of a proletariat as a class in itself, and the process of becoming a class for itself in the process, you know, by having that encounter with what Hegel would call the encounter with truth. Marx would call something different, right? But the process of the class struggle is the process through which the class becomes a class for itself, because it develops class consciousness. And only then can we really truly speak of a proletariat, because it becomes fully actualized.
And then what does that mean? Like, to say fully actualized? I mean, I think in a way, like what we're talking about is that sort of contradiction to that issue trying to be worked out on the level of, like the level of quote unquote mental health, or like the individual, like subjective experience of the world.
Yeah. So mental illness is fake news.
I mean,
there's a part of me that really wants to sort of put a disclaimer on this whole thing that, like, don't kill yourself, like, get help. And if you need medication or therapy or whatever to do that, please do it, you know?
I have a friend that I had a discussion with recently about mental illness, and I was trying to make the case that was made much more eloquently today then, that, like, yeah, sure, there are, like, you know, genetic predispositions that people have to things, but, like, a lot of this, if not most of it, is a direct result of circumstances that are enforced on you by the existence of capitalism, right? And they were really, really against that idea. And this person is a leftist, and you know, would pretty much agree with me just about when I talked about just about anything except this. They're like, no, it's chemicals in my brain.
Yeah.
Like,
so one of the things that Johann Hari talks about, which is really crucial, is saying it's just chemicals in your brain is a non-explanation. Like, it doesn't actually tell us anything. So I think that, you know, with all due respect and compassion to your comrade friend over there, they're just wrong. Because saying that, like, it's just genetics fundamentally misunderstands what biologists and geneticists have known and talked about for the last 20, 30 years, which is genetics require environmental cues to be activated, to be expressed. It is never one or the other. It is always both. There are very few things I know of and as a, you know, just to invoke, you know, my power discourse, like as a professional in this field, that are just solely the result of genetic predispositions or like genetic, like fate, let's say. It is very much about the environment and the genetic predispositions interacting. So, I mean, it's just to say otherwise is literally to step backwards 30, 40 years in the scientific research.
well, like Hari says that, some people are predisposed to responding more sensitively to external stimulants, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's just, that's true. So that part is genetic.
I remember the readings at least raised the point that I'm trying to remember which one it was, but one of them raised the point that for some people saying it's just chemistry in the brain gives them a psychological distance from the thing that's wrong with them, that allows them to sort of displace blame. It's not my fault. It's not me. It's chemicals in my brain. It's like a broken leg. It's a thing that happened to me. And it's just, it allows them to feel better about the thing that's wrong.
Well, even more so than not my fault, it's now I don't have to think about the things that happened to me that I don't want to think about.
Yes,
right?
idea. And I think that there's another element here that we have to talk about, which is especially true for like gender dynamics, especially if you're male. Like also, I have seen more times than I can count this explanation being deployed for people who already have like severe disconnection and repression of their emotional experiences, period. This is a very convenient explanation to just say, oh, well, it's just this like chemical reaction in my brain. Now I don't have to like actually address what happened to me, but also I don't have to address the intense emotional responses that actually I'm feeling all the time and that I'm using tremendous psychic energy just to like not feel. I mean, that's a big part of, I think, the effect of all of this on how we're socialized and the sort of inherent Cartesian dualism under like a capitalist system and the way that we think about, just life in general is that if those things are separate and I'm just repressing them, it is horribly, horribly exhausting. That is one of the reasons why depression is horribly, horribly exhausting to have, because it takes an unbelievable amount of just like, to sound just completely avatar woo-woo about it, like your life force just to repress the like intensive emotional responses, for years on end. I mean, it makes perfect sense why we would have very little energy to do anything, because it takes a tremendous amount of work to repress all of that stuff.
I was just gonna say, it's gonna come out one way or another. The severe emotional repression, that's probably the source of all of my problems, has been emotional repression that eventually pours out in anger, or whatever the fuck else is wrong with me.
Yeah. Everybody's got some version of these things. No one's happy, but everyone's a little too busy to see it. So they think like, oh, I'm good. Sometimes I'm like this for some reason. I don't know, but it's okay. It's like, no, you're like this because it's unexamined and undealt with trauma.
Jess, what were you going to say?
So kind of the reason I wanted to do this episode to begin with is because I was making a joke about how mental health is fake. Because I was talking about different diagnoses and stuff, and just to be clear, I have bipolar, anxiety, obsessive compulsive personality disorder. I don't actually think mental health is fake, but it's something that I noticed when I was trying to self-diagnose myself before my psychiatrist now diagnosed me, that I would be reading the DSM parameters of a certain thing, and I would be like, I have all these things, but this one could just be my ADHD, and this one could just be my depression, this one could just be bipolar, and they all have all this crossover, and it all started to feel super arbitrary to me. So I was just like, it feels like we're putting all these things into boxes when really it's just that everyone's brain is super fucked up because we've just been evolving for too long in horrible conditions, and we're all just variously fucked up in ways that we sometimes have in common with each other. So I'm just wondering, how useful... I mean, obviously, I think that certain diagnoses are useful, because had I not been diagnosed with bipolar, I would have never gone on Lamictal, which is the thing I said pretty much cured my depression. So I know that diagnoses are useful in a lot of ways, but I don't know, I'm just wondering what you think about this.
Yeah, I think that a lot of those DSM categories that are used for diagnosis they're mainly the product of research. And the idea is that if we have a label for something, it allows us to then know how to treat it effectively. Now, there are a lot of issues with labeling and stigma and, sort of power dynamics of how this works. And this is an institution that, is designed to preserve itself and preserve power. So, for example, complex post-traumatic stress disorder is not technically a DSM diagnosis. Right now, they are anticipating it will be in the next edition of the DSM. But a big reason about this is that, for whatever reason, there's a lot of ideas of why, but complex trauma is so prevalent in society that it's like, well, what would it mean if now we had to acknowledge that all these things that we just called good parenting before were actually horribly traumatizing to children? Mm-hmm. There are major implications of this. So I would say there was an article I read last year sometime that was about diagnostic categories. And one of the things it said is that most of us, if you get one label, you typically have others. So these are called comorbidities. So for example, whenever I say I have complex post-traumatic stress disorder, well, that also meant that I had major depressive disorder, I had social anxiety disorder, and then like a raft of other whoever knows what the fuck. So the idea is that these things always come in these like clusters. Well, if you start to look at any one individual person and their different clusters, the different things in that criteria to meet that diagnosis, they become so complicated so fast that there's a lot of critique that it's like, well, what's the point of even talking about single individual diagnoses if they all come together? So for another great example of this is addiction and substance use disorders and like behavioral addictions. I have to shoehorn this in because it's really crucial. One of the things that we don't talk about very much, but the model that I operate from really is, it's very big on, is that there are substance addictions and process addictions or behavioral addictions. Under a capitalist system, we vilify a lot of like substance addictions, but we glorify certain behavioral and process addictions. The idea is that the mechanism of addiction is the same no matter what. It's a way of avoiding pain and suffering. So for example, mine, even though I was sober for a long time, I was a horrible workaholic, a horrible like addict of exercise. And those things were actually just as disruptive on my life as like substances were. So the idea is that all these things typically come so close together that it's like, well, if the diagnosis gets so complex so fast and it actually becomes very hard to compare like one diagnosis with another, then what's the point of even having the categories? And the truth is, I think there's a pretty good argument not to have the categories outside of just, we have to understand that there are these whole range of issues and we all have some combination of them in a given time. But, you know, like research, I think, leads to certain categories. And I think the idea of like certain treatments or medications can be really useful if you know how to label something effectively. Those are the reasons why it's helpful. But I mean, but a lot of the time, you know, for me, I went undiagnosed and untreated effectively for years and years and years because, you know, whatever they did label me as or whatever I gave myself the label as, like actually didn't get to the heart of what the problem was. So I think it's a tough thing to square. And there are like some useful elements and a lot of elements that I think are just sort of nonsensical or like actually don't help a lot of people.
Yeah, I remember being super actually excited when I got diagnosed because I was just glad to like put a name to it or something like that. But something that a therapist or somebody had pointed out to me before was like, well, because you've already been in therapy and because I'm really self-aware, like you're already addressing the symptoms that you have, where they come from. You're already working on those. So it's like getting a diagnosis is not going to add anything to that. You're already working on it. So maybe if you're trying to find like root causes or trying to like address symptoms that someone is not already aware of or already working on, it's more helpful.
Yeah.
But
I think another really big benefit of it, and this was the case with what we used to call Asperger's, which is now just like a sort of type of autism spectrum disorder with a certain qualifier. Sometimes having a label, the most powerful thing about it is now I have solidarity and connection with other people. Like for me, that's been the most powerful thing about complex PTSD is like, holy shit, now, I mean, it does help me with treatment stuff, but also like just the feeling of not being so isolated and alone and confused about your experience and knowing that there are other people that have this experience, I think is actually a major, major reason to continue to have some type of way to diagnose or label. I just think it can be really, really powerful for people. I mean, it was for me.
Are there any disorders, I guess, that are purely chemical or genetic? Like, isn't schizophrenia like that?
Yeah, I think that all the research shows that schizophrenia is much more tied to genetics than probably a lot of other ones are. There are certain things like neurocognitive disorders that are also just developmental, or certain types of things that just like your genetics at birth like are going to lead to this disorder. I mean, they are there for sure. But even with schizophrenia though, I mean, how we engage socially around schizophrenia is also like very different, and it tends to exacerbate it and like lead to also like now you've been given the label of schizophrenia, but now you have all this like social institutional trauma that we're going to add on top of it. So I think even the ones that are like more maybe tied to genetics, how we respond to them and how they're understood and like how we treat or don't treat also like massively exacerbates those things as well. So I mean, I think there's some case that like bipolar disorder is like a little bit more tied to genetics than like maybe just depression or anxiety. But even then, I mean, some of the stuff I've read is like, yeah, but like, again, it's what's the social context that like causes those genetic predispositions to express, and it's like, that's not outside of that.
Am I entirely wrong to maybe suggest an even a further extension of the notion that it's not just what's the environmental context that brings this out, but what's the environmental context in which this genetic expression is situated? Like, there are social orders wherein particular genetic expressions it's fine if somebody's a little fucking weird. And it's like, this is situated in a society where this is allowed to exist and be expressed, and it's not suppressed and treated and like treated as sort of like a cabined outside of okay or socially acceptable behavior.
Psychopaths in the boardroom of Fortune 500 companies.
Precisely. Yeah, exactly. Whereas like in a previous society, they would have been exiled or stoned to death or something because of their behavior. In this society, they're glorified and they are amplified and given rise to the top of society. In our present society, a schizophrenic person is regarded as sort of the bottom or the outside of society. In previous societies, they might have been regarded as a prophet or a channel to the gods or something like that, and would have been glorified and regarded very highly in that society. The same sort of expression of that biological condition, or that immutable condition, is received differently in different social conditions.
I think that's one important thing. And there is another thing where even genetic predispositions themselves are malleable. So one of the things we haven't talked about yet is the intergenerational nature of trauma. That's like a really big part of all of this. So, they've done studies about indigenous peoples and how certain genetic predispositions, which are the result of colonial, sort of settler colonialism, like mass genocide, lead to certain genetic markers that will be passed down over time. So in a way, it's like, this is all cutting edge research. And it's like, we don't even know how much the social conditions probably are leading to all sorts of reshaping of genetic predispositions for everybody all the time, let alone people who are the most, oppressed and marginalized and exploited. So, I mean, I think that's the other thing, right? It's like, who knows? I mean, the dialectical nature between like the physical body and genetic expression and the social conditions is so, to me, I mean, it is such like one holistic process that the idea of like cutting this up and how we think about it, I think, is really just us buying hook, line, and sinker the social conditions under capitalism that we find ourselves in most of the time.
That made me think of something. I was reading the novel The Good Soldier Švejk by Jaroslav Hašek, and it's called the national novel of the Czech Republic because there's a Czech character of resistance, which is that a lot of people consider to be like it's national character. It's in our DNA. It's part of our genetics to be lazy and act stupid when we're told to do something that we don't want to do. And the novel is all about like a passive resistance to that a soldier puts up in when he's forced to join the Austro-Hungarian army in World War I. And like Czechs love it. They identify with it because it's how they like resisted against the Stalinist government and stuff like that. But I really identify with that. Whenever someone tells me to do something I don't want to do, I'm like, oh, I suck at that. I'm very bad at it. Yeah. Also, I'm too lazy to do that. I can't do that.
I was wondering where I got that from.
Yeah, I know. So I consider that valid, and that's part of my genetic character as bequeathed to me from my Czech ancestry. Just to kind of derail a serious fucking conversation.
I love how we've gone full blown like nationalism is now just a genetic predisposition. I love where that's what we ended up.
Well, in this instance, it was laziness and stupidity.
Yeah.
We hail from a non-historic people, though, me and Chris.
Yeah.
So what can you do?
Wait, didn't Marx say that we were a historic people and Engels said we weren't?
I don't remember.
I don't either. No. The Czechs were a non-historic people, but the Poles were a historic people.
That's right.
historically destined to be a fucking battleground between Germany and Russia.
Over and over and over.
Okay, so one of the things that we didn't talk about at all that I just wanted to really include in here is from the review of Hari's book, and that is the alienation from I mentioned alienation from the meaningful work, right? And alienation from other people are just as big in determining what causes depression as are previous traumas, right? And we talked a lot about previous traumas, but we didn't talk at all about like alienation from other people. Like, I think that is something that is getting more and more acute and has been emphasized. I mean, not emphasized, but has been accelerated over the past year because of COVID. But he mentions the between, I don't remember the dates, just in 10 years, between like 1985 and 1995 or something like that, that socialization between human beings went down by 50%. And that was before the advent of the internet, where we substitute in like the Twittering machine for actual socialization, right? And I'm assuming that there is this, as of yet, untapped infinite well of mental illnesses that are not untapped, unexplored well of mental illnesses that is our interactions with other people on social media. And I think that Richard Seymour goes into that a little bit. You know, he dabbles in psychoanalysis a little bit, so he mentions that. And one of the things is that there's this sort of substitution for actual socialization, where someone is a micro celebrity. Even if it's just among the 400 people that follow you, you are an object of some sort of celebrity. And that there is a direct correlation between being perceived on the internet and rise in suicide rates. So there's a lot of stuff to talk about. If we want to talk about like alienation and technology and mental illness, I think that social media is going to be like a giant culprit for what is making us fucking ill as a society.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Social media bad.
Like, you know, which prior to reading The Twittering Machine, I would have probably had said something like social media doesn't make us this way or these ways, whatever way we're talking about. But it really exacerbates those tendencies and it really weaponizes them and gives them a fuller expression. But now I think it also does just also make people worse.
Yeah, we're already bad. This is just making us worse. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, one thing I'll say is that there is increasingly the idea that we can be addicted to technology. So if we go back to what I said earlier, addiction is like, the question is never why the addiction. The question is why the pain. That's always the question to really ask. So I remember reading in a book by Gabor Mate called In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts on addiction. He has this story about someone who he was asking them like, well, what does it feel like whenever you do heroin? And they said, it feels like a warm hug from my mom. And I think that whenever we talk about technology in this way and alienation from other people, I think substances and addictive behaviors are like a very damaging, maladaptive stand-in for something that we're trying to get, but we don't know another way to get it. So we find like the next best thing that's sort of like comes as close as possible to that experience. I think what you're talking about is the fact that we are horribly alienated from each other. And social media is the very easy to access, on hand, on tap solution for, oh, you want to be connected to other people because you feel horribly alienated from them? Well, here you go. But the thing is that the nature of it is in itself, like it's perfectly primed for addictive behaviors. And so I think that it's, you know, we've been sold back a form of connection with each other that really just is a mechanism of exploitation and psychic devastation for us all. I mean, I don't necessarily think like sometimes maybe it can be good. I have certain communities online that I find very useful, especially around mental health stuff. But by and large, I think most of it is really just like selling you back what human connection could be, but with this sort of like dark seed in the middle of it, which is exploitation, which is further alienation. And what happens whenever you're trying to get something satisfied with an addictive behavior, it actually does not heal the wound. And so you need more and more of the actual addictive behavior or substance to try to heal the wound. But the thing is that it is impossible to heal the wound with the addictive behavior or substance, because you're not actually treating what the wound is. You're just like trying to stop the pain. And I think that that's the real insidious part about all of this, is that it's a very meaningful yearning for human connection, but the mechanism, the conditions that it's in are just sort of like perfectly designed to destroy you even more and to further alienate you from each other. But, it's great for profit.
You aren't a machine with broken parts. You are an animal whose needs are not being met. You need to have a community. You need to have meaningful values, not the junk values you've been pumped full of all your life, telling you happiness comes through money and buying objects. You need to have meaningful work. You need the natural world. You need to feel like you are respected. You need a secure future. You need connections to all these things. You need to release any shame you might feel for having been mistreated. I think it's fair to say that in order to achieve these things, we need a revolution.
All on the streets, the signs read cheaper and better technology. This capitalist division is my nightmare. Put up a sign in my face. What the fuck happened on this place? I think we made a wrong turn. Look at the lovely concrete. To my stupid job today. Got stopped at an intersection. 15 minutes of my life just rolled away. Looked at the guy next to me. Didn't look too happy. No one's happy, but everyone's too busy to see. Let's go shopping today. Drive a fancy cars to the fancy malls, and for lunch we'll have Big Macs. I wish I could turn the clock back to when I was 10, when I wasn't scared of everything, and everything wasn't so fucking crowded. When I wonder if I can ever see a horizon, or touched by billboards with shopping malls. When I wonder if this crazy world thinks I'm the one who's crazy, alright. What if I'm the one who's crazy? 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 I'm not crazy, just frustrated.